Hello, I'm Emma Louise Coffey, and you're welcome to the Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. On this week's episode, John Maher of Grass10 joins us to give an outline of the fertiliser recommendations for the spring months. And first, John explains why fertiliser is a necessity early in the grazing season.
The primary function of nitrogen fertiliser in the spring is to increase grass growth and boost grass supply. Now, when you look at things the way they have been for the last week or two, there has been cold weather, there has been a nice bit of rainfall, therefore the soil is going to be cold. When the soil is cold, then the bugs don't work on the soil and don't release nitrogen out of the soil. This is why we introduced then fertiliser and slurry as forms of fertiliser nitrogen to boost grass supply and to give the grass plant a chance to get going. And we have bred varieties now that if you can supply them with nitrogen in whatever form, that they will grow once the soil temperature starts to pick up. So at the start of the year, you know, soil temperature and weather conditions are a bit against you. So this is why we try to introduce grass into the system by applying nitrogen to enhance the grass supply on the farm, and then allow the cows to get out to grass or any other animals to go to grass. Animals at grass, they are feeding themselves and spreading their own slurry. So from an environmental perspective, just on that alone, you are going to reduce greenhouse gases and reduce ammonia emissions.
You mentioned the weather, John, and it's really, really topical. And I guess, we're trying to find a balance here between getting fertiliser out ahead of calving and also then looking at the weather and is, does that allow, spreading of chemical or chemical fertiliser or slurry. What are we looking for? Have you any criteria in terms of weather or soil conditions that are ideal on the day of spreading or in the week after spreading?
Yeah, it's just no harm. We just take a step back to see where we are with grass supply. So we obviously have pasture base, and that allows us to pick up how much grass is on farms. For those who measure, we know that's around 850 kilograms of dry matter per hectare. The main driving factor behind the grass supply in the spring is the closing strategy in the autumn. Saying that, the farmer can boost grass supply then by applying slurry or nitrogen fertilizer in the spring. And we need to look at the conditions that when you apply those, we need to be conscious of the growth and the soil temperature and the level of rainfall. So we know the growth across the winter has been about 4 or 5 kilos, again from pasture base Ireland, which is about norm, right? So there is a reasonable grass supply out there. However, I would say a lot of the growth came in the December period rather than of late. Soil temperatures have been a little bit lower because of frost, and we've had a share of rainfall as well. If you look across the country, you can talk to people about the state of grass supply, what it is there. It has kind of faded a bit in color, and there's a bit of yellowing coming in, and to me that's crying out for a nitrogen application, whether that comes in the form of slurry or chemical fertilizer, is the key point. So the grass supply is there, but it just needs a boost to get going, and that's why we try to apply slurry or chemical fertilizer. And now, just to be clear here, we're not asking for chemical fertilizer to go on top of slurry. We apply one or the other to get our, what I would call 23, 24 units thereabouts of nitrogen boost per acre. So the conditions you're looking for are obviously a rise in soil temperatures, and when the frost disappears, we've seen a rapid increase in soil temperature. So that's coming, provided the frost is not there. And the second piece then is that we don't have rainfall after application of either slurry or fertilizer, because there is a risk of loss. So you just need kind of mild settled conditions to get the benefit of nitrogen application in the form of slurry or chemical fertilizer. So we're past all the prohibitive zones of fertilizer application and slurry application, so people should be targeting that now. We asked probably first that the slurry application is targeted at the lower covers on the farm, because they're the ones that probably needed the greater boost of nitrogen and POK from the slurry. They are slower to grow as well. The slurry is a more slower form of release N, so it's more suitable. You also are applying slurry with less technology, which is just low emission slurry spreading, be it trailing shoe or dribble bar, and that applies slurry in a format that's much friendlier to the grass plants. There's much greater nitrogen capture. It's not blown up in the air. It's applied at surface level, and it doesn't coat the grass like splash plate does. So there's a big win there with less technology, and there's a higher nitrogen capture as well for the plant. So 2,500 gallons per acre of standard slurry will apply about 20 to 23 units of nitrogen per acre. That's one form, and then where we don't apply slurry, we'll be looking then to the fields or the paddocks that are fairly trafficked, will have a reasonable level of cover of grass, and to apply your half bag of protected urea, which is basically 23 units of nitrogen per acre, or 30 kilos per hectare. And that will then, when soil temperatures are 5.5 or 5 degrees or higher, there's an uptake of nitrogen. Uptake of nitrogen happens at lower temperature before growth. So uptake is about 5 degrees for soil temperature. Growth is about 6 degrees. So once we have the soil temperatures up, and you can keep an eye on pasture base and the Teagasc systems for that to see where those are at on the Grass10 newsletter, we have uptake of nitrogen either in the form of the slurry nitrogen or the chemical form, and then growth will kick off once we get 6 degrees or higher. So they're the conditions we're looking for, mild, favorable, and I don't mind a small amount of rainfall, but large amounts of rainfall you have to avoid, all right, in terms of slurry or chemical nitrogen application.
And let's follow on from some of the points that you've made there, John. I mean, you've spelled out, I guess, the quantity of slurry or urea that you recommend, that can be spread at this time of year. But let's look at a standard fertiliser plan for the spring on dairy farms. And I guess if we think about from now until the end of the first round, which is anywhere between the 1st and the 10th of April on farms, what do you recommend? So we're looking at a half bag of urea or 2,500 gallons of slurry right now. So what are the next steps after that?
Yeah, so if we're now in the latter end of January, early February, there hasn't been much fertilizer applied. Some slurry has gone out, but the plan basically revolves around the following. So we'll say the lower cover paddocks on the farm, we'll say that are trafficable from with tractors, that we apply slurry to about a third of the farm at 2,500 gallons per acre, and then we apply the chemical fertilizer in the form of protected urea to the remaining 2/3. Now there may be an odd paddock on the farm that's low lying or has water on it, and you just avoid that paddock. So you mightn't get to every paddock, but we'll go to the ones that where we can travel. So it's not essential to apply to every paddock, but to most of the farm. So that's the story for late January, February period. Then we get into the March period, and hopefully some grazing is taking place in February. I would love for slurry to go out onto the grazed ground. Again, about 2,500 gallons per acre. Some of the slurry might need to go to the silage ground as well. So again, we should target another third of the farm, and that third shouldn't have got slurry in the first application. So this is new territory for slurry. Again, about 2,500 gallons per acre, right? And then we'll top that up. That'll supply about 23 units, and then we top that up sometime in the latter half of March with another 23 units, bringing you up to about 60 to 70 units for the first week of April. The remaining parts of the farm that hasn't got slurry in late February or early March will get somewhere close to a bag of protected urea, which is about 46 units. Then that'll bring that up to about 60 to 70 units as well. I think the key point here is in the first application that if we do slurry, we don't apply nitrogen in February, and then when we come to March and where we apply slurry, we only apply about half a bag of urea to account for the 23 units coming from the slurry that's applied to the grazed paddocks in early March or late February, or whatever time in March and to the silage ground, so that the slurry N is accounted for.
And I guess, John, when you talk about the lower covers that people are targeting, so a third of your ground that you're going to spread slurry on right now, essentially what farmers are doing is they've completed their first walk of the year and they've identified the bottom third of that grass wedge. The middle third is what they're targeting to get cows out to for, the first few weeks of grazing.
In February, when cows start calving, you're going to have a high proportion of heifers. They're not long calved. It takes a while for the intake of the animals to rise. It takes a while for a proportion of the cows that are calved to increase in number. So you're trying to get through land in the month of February that are lower cover to try and reach your spring rotation targets of having about 30% of the farm grazed by the 1st of March. So you are going to target the lower cover ground. That will be faster to recover as well, and you move through ground faster. The higher cover territory will be probably grazed in the first half of March. However, whether it's high cover or low cover or medium cover, they all need a boost of nitrogen, and that can come in the form of slurry for the lower cover ground, and for the medium to higher cover ground, that has to be fertiliser nitrogen for me.
Where you have the scenario, John, and we do see it on some farms where they're really prioritizing spring grass over autumn grass, and they're closing in very early November, and they have few light covers on the farm. So they don't have a third of the farm that has a cover of less than, say, 800 or 900. Where do they put the slurry?
Yeah, so there's a flexible approach required here. There are certain paddocks that you can travel on, and there's certain paddocks you can't travel on. The idea is to try and go to the paddocks with the lowest amount of grass in them for slurry. You may not have enough of them if you've carried a lot of cover. However, the machines that are there now allow you to apply slurry into even up to a covers of 1,000 if you're doing the trailing shoe, which will not coat the grass because it creates a slit in the grass and separates it. So there's flexibility here, and I think that's the key. Equally, you may only get 20% of the farm covered with slurry in late January, early February. But then if you get that ground grazed in February, you can apply more slurry in late February, early March. So it's just a case of being smart with the technology that's there. And, obviously low emission slurry spreading, you can apply greater amounts of slurry on greater areas of land with that technology because it doesn't coat the grass like splash plate. Equally, if you get land grazed, you can apply more slurry later on to a greater area because you have that land grazed off. So it's just a matter of being flexible and working with what you have.
And John, talk through the value of slurry in the springtime versus summer. So, there is an opportunity to go out with a heavy cover of slurry, after silage, but there is some research that would show us it's more valuable in the springtime. So can you give us some more insight into that?
Yeah, look, we've had a lot of conversation on this call about slurry, and the reason we do that is because the nitrogen capture of slurry is way higher in the spring than it is in the summer. And that's because we have cool, moist conditions, and that allows more nitrogen capture of nitrogen from the slurry in the spring compared to the summer. In the summer, you have way higher temperatures, you have bare ground, and the risk is that when you spread slurry, that more of that nitrogen is lost to the air, mostly in the form of ammonia. That's what you smell it. So there's less of that loss in the spring. There's less of that loss with low emission technology compared to splash plate, because splash plate blows it up in the air. Low emission technology puts it down at ground level. So, we know the environment we're heading into going forward with, reduced chemical fertilizer applications by 2030. So we have to capitalize as much as we can on the nutrients that exist on the farm. So applying slurry in spring with less technology allows much greater nitrogen capture by the grass plant, by the sward, and by the soil. So this is why we target as much as we can the slurry to be applied earlier in the year than later in the year. Just in terms of P and K, P and K is not influenced by whether summer or spring application, but and there may be some slurry that has to go back in size ground, but as much as possible from a nitrogen point of view, we're trying to get as much as the slurry spread in the spring to capture as much as we can. Also, from a point of view of growing a silage crop and growing grass, when we get P and K out earlier, it's a greater boost to the sward than it is later in the season.
And I suppose finally on the topic of slurry, I saw an interesting tool that was released today by Francis Quigley at Teagasc. It's the Slurry Spreader Calibration tool, and that might be useful for farmers as they move into, I suppose, a new era, moving away from the splash plate to the low emission slurry spreading tools. And his advice there is to, I suppose, spread your first load and time it. And then he has a tool where you can insert the amount of time it took you to spread the load, the tank size, the width that the technology is using, and the application rate, and that will dictate what speed you should travel at. I thought it was a useful, and it's a very user-friendly tool. When we look to fertiliser, John, you mentioned urea as the product of choice in the spring. Why urea as opposed to CAN, or maybe some fertiliser with other compounds like your 18612 or so?
Yeah, so look, we pick protected urea over the other forms of nitrogen fertilizer for a number of reasons, but we'll start with the basic one of the way urea works. It likes moist conditions to get to allow the nitrogen move from the urea form into the plant. That's when it works best. And also the way that urea breaks down, it breaks from urea into the ammonium form, which is much more friendlier to the soil. It clings to the soil because of the way it's charged. There's a positive charge on that ion, and the clay particles are negative, so they like one another. When you go to the CAN form, it's very soluble, and it's in the nitrate form, and that's negatively charged, and the clay is negatively charged, so they tend to repel one another a little bit. So that's one point. But I suppose the biggest thing with CAN type forms of fertilizer is that because it's extremely soluble, if there's water around, wherever the water will go, this fertilizer form will go with it, right? So, nitrate is very soluble in water, and if the water moves left, right, up, or down, unfortunately, that's where the nitrogen will go. So, for that reason, we much prefer urea forms in spring. And you mentioned 18612. Most of the compound fertilizers are CAN based. That's something that has to change going forward, because when they are CAN based, the nitrate form is prone to leaching because of movement of water. So there's greater movement of water risk in the spring than there is at other times during the year. This is why then we just look towards the urea forms of fertilizer N application in January, February, March, and into April and spring. The recent advances in protected urea now means that urea can be spread across the summer months as well, because the risk of the ammonia or the urea turn into an ammonia form and be lost to the air is inhibited by this protection mechanism on the granule that stops it being lost to the air. So we now can apply protected urea for the grazing season, and without having to worry about losses to the air.
So, John, I think you've given us a really good outline as to a step through the spring and how we can support and boost grass growth by the use of fertilizers, whether it's slurry or chemical N. Looking then to why we're doing it, and it is to get that boost in grass supply at a time of year where grass is limited. Can you give us some information on what we would expect in terms of the response of our spring nitrogen applications in the form of grass growth?
Yeah, look, people have ideas of the cost of grass around 7 or 8 cents a kilogram dry matter, right? And that's the standard value of grass. But, and there's a big but here, the value of grass in springtime is twice that, right? And it's 4 times higher than the value of in summer. And the reason for that is you're displacing the higher cost feeds of silage and meal. for many farmers, irrespective of what system they're in. They cost way more. So spring grass has a very, very high value at 16 cents a kilo. And that's why then, people say to you, okay, we apply spring fertilizer in modest amounts, which we do. But for, what we call modest responses. So, but the value of grass is very, very high here. And look, as a standard guide, right, for people, like the difference between a silage-based diet and a grass-based diet is about 4 kilos a meal. So that's a lot of money. So that's why we look after trying to boost grass supply in the spring and increase grass growth by doing so. The average response is about 10 to 12 kilos in the average year. Some years will be higher, some years will be a bit lower. The break-even point is about 5 kilos. So what I mean by that is for every kilo of nitrogen we apply in the form of slurry or protected urea, we get about 10 to 12 kilos back in terms of grass. So, grass at 16 cents a kilo, if we get 5 kilos of response, that's around 80 cents. That's the break-even point of the fertilizer cost, right? So we get 10 to 12. So we get twice the value of grass for the cost of the fertilizer, and sometimes higher. We've even looked at this in the heavy soils farms. Now, let's be clear with the heavy soils farms, they don't apply fertilizer or slurry to all the products because some are a little bit on the heavier side or too damp to travel upon. But where they do apply, we know that response for the last 2 years is around 8.5, 9 kilos. So even on farms that have, heavier land, once we're smart with our application and applied to the right products that are drier, high ryegrass content, medium cover, reasonable soil fertility, there is a good response here to fertilizer application in the spring in modest amounts, but it's very, very high value because it displaces meal in particular and silage to a lesser extent. So that's why we're after it. Michael O'Donovan and Michael Egan have done research here in Moore Park to look at the nitrogen recovery of those applications. And again, it's only about 20-25 units per acre, and it's well above 50%. Because the grass plant is about to take off, it's a new season, it's new growth. The plant is starting to get going as day length gets longer. So between nitrogen response, in terms of the level of grass grown and the nitrogen recovery of the grass grown, this makes it well worthwhile. Even though the responses are moderate, the recovery is high and the win is big.
And I guess to sum up the conversation, John, like, you've explained it quite well in terms of, the things that determine how much grass we have on farm in the spring is very much how we close the farm in the autumn and the use of nitrogen in the springtime. We've no control now over what we've done in the autumn. That has, I suppose, been and gone at this stage, but there's a huge opportunity to use our slurry to the best as we possibly can based on what we have in the yard, and also then the use of protected urea at this time of the year in order to guarantee us some grass on the farm throughout the spring. And as you say, it is a hugely valuable feed product to our animals. And I guess I suppose to finish up, we're getting very busy on farms. A lot of farms have cows calved already, and the slurry and fertilizer is maybe something that will fall through the cracks in terms of, the cows have become the priority. So I would encourage farmers to, lean on the contractor at this time of year in order to ensure the nitrogen is out to support the grass supply. Thank you, John.
Thanks very much, Emma Louise.
That's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast, and my thanks to John Maher for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify, and for more information go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Emma Louise Coffey, and join me next time for your Dairy Edge.